Well, joining me in the studio today are the Sevenoaks MP and Government Energy Minister Michael Fallon and also Diane James, one of UKIP's newly elected MEPs. Thank you both for coming. So first, we learned last week that the UK population has grown more in the past year than in any other EU country, and the rate is fastest in London and the South East, fuelled partly by immigration and partly by a rising birth rate. So are we doing enough to plan ahead for that growth? It's interesting, Michael Fallon, you've been in government. Planning for the long term is a necessary job, but one that governments are very reluctant to do, not least because the decisions they need to make with housing, energy, some of which we'll discuss later in the programme, tend to be hugely unpopular.
Yes, and the census is only every 10 years, so often you're catching up on where the increase in the population has been. But it was a big jump, and half of it was immigration, and I think part of the answer is getting immigration under control. There were no controls at all until this government. It was virtually unlimited.
I'm sure you're keen to talk about immigration, but in terms of the actual planning, the infrastructure provisions, the thinking in government, Diane, do you think it is the system that means we're not that good at it?
Yes,
or
I think
there's
undoubtedly there is an issue with the system. I mean, we've heard in the last few weeks that there's problems with the whole e-borders situation. The International Passenger Survey has been ridiculed by certainly the Labour Party in Parliament.
I'm talking about the infrastructure that's here, regardless of where that population growth is coming from.
But if you can't count the people in, if you don't know where you're going to put them or where they're going to land up, it does make it very difficult for local authorities. If you go back a year, I think it was the leader of Kent County Council who made the point that when he foresaw that when the restrictions on Romanians and Bulgarians, for instance, were going to be lifted in January, that the impact on Kent County Council was going to be somewhere in the region of 1 million.
Although, of course, the numbers that came in proved to be nothing like predicted.
There's a good example of somebody actually trying to get a grip on things, trying to think ahead. But sometimes I think the issue there is that the message that the local authorities want to send up to national government isn't always received well. OK, we'll have to leave it there.
If, like me, you're a fan of the Archers, you'll have been interested to hear the Radio 4 programme praised for the way it reflects real life in rural areas. One example of that is the recent and no doubt future storyline about plans to put solar panels in Ambridge. It's a big issue here in the South East because of the boom in applications for large-scale solar farms over the past 2 years. Sarah has been to Kent to find out more.
You know what 10 megawatts means, don't you?
I've not really had time to look it up.
Well, that'll be about 50 acres of prime Ambridge land covered with solar panels. Your mother's up in arms, Adam.
Plans for a solar farm ruffling feathers in the Archers. But the Radio 4 drama is a reality for many rural communities in the South East, where there's a boom in applications for large-scale solar developments as landowners rush to get connected to the grid ahead of a change in government subsidies next year. This prime agricultural land near Headcorn is a case in point. It could soon be a so-called solar city covering 157 acres. And it's one of many proposals in Kent and Sussex. Campaigners say schemes like this will interfere with food production and blight the landscape.
There's nothing green about this. This is greed. And all across this area we have similar applications for large-scale installations where developers are merely chasing the access to the grid without any consideration to where they are siting them. It has a massive impact on our landscape, but also on our food production. This is all great to agricultural land.
Farmers have been quick to adopt solar energy as a stable way to secure an income. Generous subsidies have meant the number of large-scale projects in the South East has mushroomed. There are currently 28 developments over 5 megawatts, compared to just 3 up and running 2 years ago. That's a 9-fold increase. A further 49 have planning permission in Kent and Sussex. This 125-acre solar park on the Romney Marsh in Kent is one of the biggest in the country. It's already generating enough electricity to power a small town, despite barely being completed. These panels are built on some of the most fertile land in the country. But the question is, how many more installations on this scale are we likely to see now that the government has recognised that large-scale solar farms can be unpopular with local communities? The Community Secretary, Eric Pickles, recently ordered another large project to be scrapped, saying it was unsightly and a waste of arable land. But just last week, that decision was overruled in the High Court as unlawful. So, with the clock ticking until government subsidies are slashed and with no legislation to stop developments, there's a question mark about whether we really will see the demise of large-scale installations.
Well, joining us now is Richard Knox-Johnson of the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. His letter to local authorities said, "We strongly support solar. It's a priority for this government. It's clean, low-cost energy and will help us meet our renewable targets." So do you want solar farms or not?
We want solar, but we want it on roofs and we don't want it on good agricultural land. And there's been a surge of applications, so we've had to put a stop to the subsidy. That's what we're consulting.
Caught you out by the sound of it. You didn't expect it to be as popular as it has been.
No, but we've acted, and we're now consulting on ending the subsidy from the end of this financial year in March, and we've issued tougher planning guidance that my colleague referred to, making sure that they do not use good agricultural land, and if they do get through the council, then those applications can be called in by the Secretary of State. We want more renewable energy in total, but solar was now threatening to take too large a share of the budget. So we've had to put a stop to the subsidy. The cost of these things has come down enormously. The panels are much cheaper now. They're being imported from China, and they're not being put in the right place.
You've heard reassurances from Michael. They're bringing forward the end of subsidies. They want them on roofs, not on agricultural land. Eric Pickles is prepared to intervene. What more can the government do?
No, I think the government's made it very clear. It's put policy position on that now, and that's very helpful. We are obviously in favour of solar energy as an organisation, but like Michael, we want them on roofs, and there's plenty of roof space on industrial buildings and farm buildings in the country.
What's UKIP's policy? We know you don't like onshore wind farms. What about solar panels?
We don't like those either. We think they're vastly inefficient. I mean, they're intermittent, they're completely unreliable. And if you look at what can be recouped in terms of energy from solar panels, you're looking at 15%.
Well, the industry would argue they're just getting started, and that's another criticism they have of Michael's government.
That's a very interesting point to make. But, you know, what do you do? Do you invest in inefficient forms of energy, or do you wait till technology gets to a stage where it does become efficient and worthwhile and
clean,
reliable?
They're cheap, and they help us meet the renewable targets which we have to meet.
OK, well, it's the European Union, remember, that's directing this whole issue about use of renewables. I would counter-argue personally, and I'm sure UKIP would as well, we've got a vast amount of coal reserves. We have Germany that's investing in new coal technology in terms of coal-fire burning power stations. Why not use that subsidy system here in the UK to use an indigenous energy resource rather than invest in one that's so inefficient and doesn't give the return we need?
Your leader, Nigel Farage, last week announced plans to hold local referenda on issues.
Absolutely.
Is this the kind of thing you might want to introduce a referendum for?
I think it would be. You know, this is exactly the sort of issue that, firstly, the coalition government tried to address with its localism bill, which clearly hasn't worked and isn't working at all. And communities do have an issue with developments that threaten the character of their communities, threaten the nature.
And Michael's
this is a prime example.
with this issue. It's been a running theme for your government since you introduced the National Planning Policy Framework. The trouble is, this is yet another issue that in Tory heartlands like Kent and Sussex, you're alienating your own voters. They're going to vote for Diane rather than you on issues like this.
Well, I'm not quite clear about UKIP's energy policy. I think Diane's right. We need more homegrown energy of all kinds. We've seen the threat in the Ukraine to their gas supplies. We've seen what's been going on in Iraq.
You'd like more fracking, as we know.
We'd like more shale gas. We need more nuclear. We are short of energy. We need to have more energy capacity in this country. She's absolutely right about that.
But what about that issue I raised with you about alienating your core voters who don't want to see these large-scale farms on lovely green countryside?
Well, that's one of the reasons we're putting an end to it. That's why we're consulting on it.
There's an issue, of course, there in terms of the legacy of those solar sites that are already there, and that won't go away.
We need to move on. I'm afraid this is a subject we'll return to. And Richard Knox-Johnson, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, the news that maternity services at Eastbourne's District General Hospital will be permanently downgraded didn't come as a big surprise, but it was a bitter disappointment for campaigners who've been fighting those plans for 8 years. From now on, any mother in the town facing a complicated birth will have to travel to the consultant-led unit at St Leonard's. Monica Korinika-Vackley has been involved in the campaign from the start. One of her babies died at the DGH in Eastbourne, and she had 3 other difficult births. I spoke to her last week.
Thank goodness I'm not having our babies now, because I would be frightened to death if I was having children now. The services aren't there. We went through very traumatic experiences with our children, and they wouldn't be here today.
Well, several clinical commissioning groups were involved in that decision. The chair of one of them said it was the best decision they could have come up with, and the change will make mothers and babies safer. So the NHS says lives will be saved. The campaigners actually have the opposite argument. They say lives will be lost. Diane James, you've worked in healthcare for 30 years. Who do you believe in this debate?
I go with the campaigners on this. I mean, I'm very disappointed to hear the chair say it's the best they could have achieved. That is not the sort of words that are going to reassure people who want those services, want to see that hospital stay open, don't want to see services centralised in another location. What they want to hear is best practice, they want access to services, and it seems contradictory to what Simon Stevens has said in terms of the NHS, where he didn't see the future in the closure and merger of smaller hospitals.
Think tanks, Royal College of Surgeons have always argued that actually fewer, larger units, when you can recruit better, more experienced consultants, are safer for patients, even if they have to travel. But you don't believe that?
Well, first of all, we're talking here about pregnant ladies. We're talking about situations where there are difficult births. So I'm actually more in favour of following what the Royal College of Midwives have said. And they have endorsed this to a degree, but then they've also raised the aspects that there is the problem with the road access in terms of the distance that patients now have to travel. There is an issue that there needs to be an improvement in the transport network. You know, that's everything from public bus services or such. And also there's going to be a need in terms of sort of either hopper or link services. Now, when they are, you know, they're the experts, in my opinion, when they can put those three very good reasons up to say this may work, but we've still got very serious concerns. You know, can those patients get there? Can they see the best practice in terms of a good clinical lead, rather than staying in an area where they feel comfortable and actually bringing the service to them or retaining the service for them there? I think that's the problem we've got.
If it is the right thing, though, do they not have a responsibility to say to their constituents, actually, this could be a good thing for you, you'll get better care?
I think that would be realistic, and that's what I think every voter would want to see their MP doing. But all the time there is, for instance, the party whip from the health minister to say, no, keep on side, you know, I've got to get my NHS reforms through. You know, I may be sounding rather cynical and sarcastic about this, but that's what it's all about. We have a health minister who wants to deliver efficiency savings in the NHS. He's putting pressure on the local service providers to actually deliver those savings. And we are talking a lot of money, 20 billion over the lifetime of this Parliament, this government. You know, that's an awful lot of financial pressure, and a very, very short-term response is to close hospitals, centralise services.
Michael Fallon, things are going to get worse for South Eastern passengers, not least because we've got 3 years of major disruption at London Bridge.
Yes, London Bridge being rebuilt, and really they've got to work this out now. There's got to be proper compensation and alternative means provided by the network to make sure people aren't disadvantaged.
The network says it's a Department of Transport's problem.
Well, we've got to sort that out, because people make their life choices about how they're going to commute and so on, and could really lose out in this. So they've really got to answer that properly.
Diane James, South Eastern, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I'm sure it is. I mean, you know, one of your opening, topics today was this issue of immigration. People come here,
would come back
they
to that.
need
I'm sorry,
access.
we're going to have to leave it there because that's all we've got time for this week. My thanks to both my guests, Michael Fallon and Diane James.